So I'd like to welcome everyone to this study session. Today we're going to be talking about gun violence protection. And we have three amazing speakers joining us. Rabbi Aaron Alexander, you want to wave to everybody? There we go. Seems like a parade. We have Loren Lieb and Charlie Sarosy. About 3 months ago, I went to an event sponsored or run by Virginia Classic, who's in the back. Virginia, why don't you raise your hand? And Virginia did this great gathering of clergy to discuss ways to bring new ideas into the discussion about gun control. And while I was there, I met Jackie Elkins. And Jackie Elkins sent me an email. I had a note about it somewhere. Sent me an email the next day and said, if you need any help ever organizing anything, to give me a call. So about 2 months ago, I gave her a call and said, can you give me a couple names of people who'd be great to have on a panel? After that, she took over the whole program. She called everyone. She brought in flyers. She has been amazing. I'd like to claim that I organized this panel, but Jackie really did 90% of the work, and I'm very grateful to her and her enthusiasm for this panel today. I truly appreciate it. So our format today is each speaker is going to speak about 10 to 12 minutes on a different aspect of gun control, gun prevention. And then, once we're done with these three speakers, we're going to open the floor to questions. So I believe we decided we're going to start with Loren today. So Loren, if you can begin.
All right. I'm really delighted to be here today, and I think this is such an important topic for everyone to address. We have an epidemic here in the U.S., and we really need faith communities to get behind this. My background is in public health, and so I'm going to be talking for a few minutes about the public health approach to preventing gun violence. Public health is the practice of preventing disease and promoting good health in communities and population groups. So some examples of achievements of public health include the control of smallpox and polio through vaccination programs, and the recognition of tobacco as a health hazard with subsequent change of social norms around our attitudes towards cigarette smoking. Gun violence is an important public health concern as it kills or injures 100,000 people every year in the United States. And the rate of gun death in the US is higher than all other industrialized nations. Yet for some reason, we seem to accept this as an inevitable part of American life rather than viewing it as a preventable condition, which it should be viewed as. We can use a public health approach to analyze the problem of gun violence and to implement solutions. And some might ask, why would it be a public health approach rather than a law enforcement approach? The majority of firearm deaths in the US are from suicide, and most suicides are committed with a gun. So a person who's experiencing a mental health crisis should not have easy access to a firearm. But most suicides are completed in the home using the family gun. So that's not a law enforcement issue. Most homicides are committed with a gun, and victims of firearm assaults often know their attacker. Most homicides are not carefully planned in advance. Rather, they're an impulsive reaction to a situation that's gone bad that was escalated with the presence of a gun, a la George Zimmerman. And there is a link between the prevalence of guns in a community and the homicide rate. So the focus of primary prevention is to interrupt the potential for harm long before there's a bad guy with a gun in a position to harm somebody. So we need the intervention to take place long before there's a need for law enforcement action. And about 20,000 people are injured or killed every year in accidental shootings. Clearly, that's not a law enforcement issue. We can't fix this problem by bigger police forces and building more prisons. We have to prevent it from happening in the first place. So the public health approach involves 4 basic steps, which are to assess the problem, identify the causes, figure out what works to fix it, and then to implement that. So let me describe the problem in a little more detail. Every day in the US, about 280 people, every day in the US, 280 people are shot. 86 of them die. Every day in the US, 50 children and teens are shot. 8 of them die every day. And for each person directly affected, there's all the collateral damage that ripples through their network of family and friends and coworkers. So while 100,000 people are directly affected by gun violence, the true number, the number of people truly affected by gun violence is in the many times beyond that. And the medical and societal costs of gun violence are in the billions of dollars. But we need to know more than just about the numbers. We need to know about the dangers of guns in the home, the type of guns used most often in crime, the role that gun dealers play in gun trafficking, design changes that could make guns safer. Those are just a few of the areas that we need more information. And if this were any other health condition that was affecting hundreds of thousands of Americans every year, there would be a concerted national prevention and control effort. Firearm injuries are the 5th leading cause of premature death in the US, just after motor vehicle accidents. But we spend about $543 million per year on motor vehicle injury prevention research, $543 million. That compares to less than $2 million spent researching gun violence prevention. Things that cause about the same amount of premature death in the US. So why is there a disconnect between the magnitude of the problem and the money that we spend to fix it? Well, it's because Congress has been influenced by the gun lobby to restrict federal funds for firearm-related research, and the prohibition has been in effect since 1996. CDC's budget for injury prevention research was cut after they published a study that found after a study was published that they had funded that found that a gun in the home increased the risk of homicide and suicide. The restriction was later expanded to all of the Department of Health and Human Services, which also includes the National Institutes of Health. So obviously that dealt a serious blow to the field of gun violence prevention research in the US. And when reporting on homicide and suicide, CDC doesn't even use the word firearm generally in their publications, preferring euphemisms like the availability of lethal means. So research into how to prevent a leading cause of death shouldn't be restricted or censored by a lobby whose purpose is to increase product sales. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or the ATF, is responsible for enforcing federal gun laws, but its authority is also severely compromised by restrictions imposed by Congress. ATF's record keeping is by design an antiquated manual system for researching guns used in crimes and for monitoring gun trafficking. ATF is prohibited from requiring gun dealers to conduct annual inventories of their stock to assure that they can account for all their guns. And inventories are necessary to identify dealers that facilitate gun trafficking. Gun manufacturers knowingly flood the market with more guns than can be sold in the legal US market, resulting in guns being diverted to the criminal market here and in Mexico. A small number of corrupt gun dealers supply the majority of guns used in crime. As an example, during a 5-year period, 52 crime guns were traced to a single gun store in Washington. During that same gun store, during a 3-year period, they sort of lost more than 250 guns from their inventory that they couldn't account for. Now, one of those lost guns was used by the DC snipers in 2002 to kill 10 people. Buford Furrow, who shot my son at the North Valley Jewish Community Center and 4 others and later murdered a postal worker, he also had a gun from the same store. You know, those are 2 very high-profile crimes linked to the same gun shop and a shop that couldn't account for a lot of guns in their inventory. But for some reason, the ATF was really kind of powerless to do anything to shut this dealer down. And we know that about 1/3 of American homes have a firearm, and a gun in the home is more likely to result in homicide, suicide, or accidental shooting of someone in the home than to be used for self-protection. Now, a gun in the home doesn't have to pose a danger to the residents of the home if it's properly stored, if it's locked, if the ammunition is locked separately. But many firearm owners prefer to keep their gun loaded, unlocked, and ready for use. So in the US, we have about 3 million children living in households where there's a loaded and unlocked gun, a very risky situation, especially when you consider that a child as young as 3 years old has the strength to pull a trigger, and that almost half of all accidental shootings among children happen at the home of a friend or a relative. So parents need to know that they always have to ask if there are unsafely stored guns in the homes where their children play. And if they find that out, they need to make some decisions about where their children are going to play. We expect that the products we buy are safe and hazard-free. And there are monitoring systems in place to identify hazardous products and to remove them from store shelves. The monitoring might also result in product design changes to make them safer. So as an example, parents of children know that you cannot get a child's hooded sweatshirt that has a drawstring around the neck anymore. Adults, yes. Children, no. That's because the string poses a strangulation hazard for children. Teddy bears are carefully regulated so that the button eyes can't come off and pose a choking hazard for a baby. The Consumer Product Safety Commission is the agency that's responsible for ensuring the safety of products that we purchase, except for firearms. And I looked at the Consumer Product Safety Commission website last week and looked at some of the recalls that are currently ongoing. One is for a pair of high-heeled shoes that might cause a fall hazard. Another was for a knife and a sheath set, a knife and sheath, that posed a laceration hazard. But there will never be a recall of a firearm. That's because there's no federal agency responsible for ensuring that they're safe, an inherently deadly product, ensuring that they're free of design flaws and that they operate properly. There are no federal regulations against cheaply made guns that misfire or fire when they're dropped. There are no safety standards. So a $5 disposable camera will tell you if it's ready to shoot a bullet, to shoot a picture. A $5 disposable camera will tell you if it's ready to shoot a picture. But a gun will not tell you if it's ready to shoot a bullet. We have cars now that are being designed with accident avoidance technology, but the gun industry isn't doing anything to make guns less dangerous. And then again, why is that? And it's because the gun lobby has influenced Congress to ensure that there's no agency responsible for oversight of the gun industry, and it's the only industry to enjoy that kind of protection. And normally, in the event if a consumer is injured by a product, their recourse would be to sue the manufacturer for damages. But once again, the gun industry enjoys a protection that no other industry does. In 2005, Congress passed a law protecting the gun industry from most lawsuits. So we can learn lessons from looking at the dramatic changes in motor vehicle-related deaths in the past 40 years. From 1970 to 2010, the population of the United States has gone from 200 million to 300 million. The number of cars on the road has increased 50%, from 89 million to 131 million. During this period, when cars on the road are increasing, the population is increasing, the number of motor vehicle fatalities has actually decreased by 40%. So how did that happen, with all these numbers escalating? It's been the result of research, innovation, behavior change, technology, policy, legislation, multifaceted approach that's targeting the individual, the vehicle, and the infrastructure. So why can't we do the same with gun violence prevention? So, ensuring that gun owners are properly trained in safe storage and handling of their firearms, and ensuring that dangerous people are prohibited from purchasing guns would be a reasonable first step. A background check is required to purchase a gun if you're getting it from a federally licensed firearm dealer. But purchases in other settings don't require any type of background check. And I think many people just really are not aware of this fact. And the numbers are staggering. About 40% of all firearm purchases in the US are legally completed without a background check, mostly at gun shows and on the internet. So that's about 2 million guns being sold every year with no background check that could be being sold to felons, to domestic abusers, to terrorists, to all kinds of dangerous people who really shouldn't have one, with no questions asked. And there are lots of examples of hidden camera footage of people buying guns at gun shows for cash, without any paperwork, without showing any identification, and sometimes even admitting to the seller that, saying, oh, it's a good thing there's no paperwork because I probably couldn't pass the background check anyway, and the sale is completed. That's reckless and irresponsible. Background checks save lives. They've prevented almost 2 million prohibited persons from purchasing guns. So why is the gun lobby blocking this effort to have a background check on every firearm purchase? We certainly would not sit back and condone 40% of people getting on a plane simply choosing to go around the TSA checkpoint. We wouldn't stand for that. So firearms should include safety features like loaded chamber indicators, trigger locks, smart gun technology so that they could only be used by the authorized user. Weapons designed for military use should not be in the civilian market. The ATF should be given the resources to monitor the firearm industry for compliance with laws and regulations, and the industry should be subject to litigation if they're negligent. We should evaluate policies like insurance requirements for gun owners and maybe higher taxes on guns and ammunition to support safety and education programs and to create a fund for people harmed by guns. The US leads the world in per capita firearm ownership, and not by a little, but by a lot. It's estimated that there are nearly 300 million guns in the US. That's 89 guns for every 100 people. We far exceed Yemen, that's in second place, of per capita firearm ownership. If guns made us safer, the US would be the safest nation in the world, and clearly we're not. The rate of gun ownership in the US is decreasing, but it seems that more guns are being concentrated into fewer hands. And the reasons that people are owning guns seems to be changing as well. In the past, guns were commonly owned for hunting, but today they're most commonly owned for self-defense and increasingly for armed revolt against the government. You laugh, but it's true and scary. The lethality of non-sporting guns is increasing and the use of military-style weapons is proliferating. So we need to change the social norms around guns and violence. Kids shouldn't view guns as being cool, and we need to address inadequacies in the mental health system to assure that anyone who needs mental health treatment is able to get it. The gun lobby seems completely unmoved by tragedies like Newtown, Aurora, Virginia Tech, Oak Creek, or the North Valley Jewish Community Center shooting, and the 32 people killed, murdered every single day. Instead, it uses these tragedies to foment fear and paranoia to encourage more guns in more places. From a policy perspective, gun violence is a health concern that affects hundreds of thousands of people and costs billions of dollars annually. From a moral perspective, the irresponsible and unregulated manufacture, sale, and ownership of firearms harms families and communities, and often the most vulnerable people in our communities. For too long, our elected officials have allowed health-related policy to be dictated by a powerful lobby that seeks to bolster its profits to the detriment of society. And we have collectively allowed that to happen. And I think faith communities have an opportunity to embrace and support sensible gun policies. And we can't continue to just accept 100,000 lives affected by gun violence as part of American life. Thank you.
And now Charlie Sarosy will talk about gun violence prevention through the lens of our legal system.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming here today. I know there were some other breakout sessions, so we all appreciate you choosing to sit here with us today. I'm briefly going to talk about the main Supreme Court decision that kind of gave the Second Amendment the power that it has today. The Heller decision from 2008, talk about a couple federal laws and the gaps in those federal laws. Loren kind of mentioned them with the background checks before. And then also talk about a little about the legislation that came up in the Senate this past summer and then failed. And then talk about California state laws briefly as well. And then also just give a broad recommendation for gun control organizing and how to respond to gun rights organizing and how well they are at that. So in all honesty, I never really looked at the Second Amendment until I started law school. And if you haven't read it, it's actually one of the most poorly, in my personal opinion, poorly written amendments in the Constitution. So the actual text is in the packet that we gave you, if you want to take a look at it. It says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now what I want you to do, if you have it in front of you, is take a line and draw a line right after free state and divide that sentence into two, because that's essentially what the Supreme Court did in 2008. They said the first part about the regulated militia being necessary to a free state, it's called a prefatory clause. So what that means is that it just announces a purpose for the amendment, but not the only purpose. Because according to the Supreme Court in 2008, the right to keep and bear arms back when the Constitution was formed was a right that everyone understood existed. The issue was not whether the right existed, but whether they should codify it in the Constitution in the first place. And at that time, when they were forming the Constitution, the issue was whether the government would come and take their guns away and ban the militia. So they wanted to ensure that they put this right in the Constitution to ensure that individuals could still form their own militia and rise against the government and prevent against tyranny. But even though that was the reason why it was put in the Constitution, that's not the only reason why the right existed. So what the Supreme Court said was just kind of ignore that first part. The second part is what matters. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. And that is the core of the Second Amendment, is that you have this right to keep and bear arms regardless of the militia aspect. You have the right to keep and bear arms that is an individual right for the purpose of primarily self-defense. And also for hunting, and also if you want to rise against the government to prevent against tyranny, good luck with that. So basically, and gun rights supporters, they'll come out and they'll say that, and they'll say that this right is so expansive beyond what the actual Supreme Court said. So what the right actually does provide is, like I said, an individual right to keep and bear arms, but only in the home. That is what the Supreme Court opinion was limited to, because the laws at issue in that case were about the keeping of guns in the home. That case does not explicitly give the right to carry guns in public. And that's actually going to be the new thing, the new issue that will become before the Supreme Court in time, probably in a couple years. So what the Supreme Court has not said, they have not said that you have a right to keep and bear arms in public, anywhere in public. They in fact said there are certain places where restrictions on where you carry guns should stay in place, such as in schools, such as in government buildings. Restrictions on felons and those who are mentally ill, those should remain in place. And they also say it is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever in any manner whatsoever and for whatever purpose. So gun rights supporters like to quote from Heller from this opinion in 2008 and say that it gives them this expansive right to carry a gun and do whatever they want with it. But you just have to look at the text of the actual opinion. It does maintain some limits. So I just wanted to point those out because if people approach you and talk about this, they're usually very good about quoting from this opinion or quoting other things and saying, I have this right. But you just have to know the text of this opinion and base it off that. So in light of that, Loren, like I said, mentioned this before, but some of the main federal law loopholes when it comes to guns, the big one is the lack of background checks or private gun sales. It's known as the gun show loophole. But it's not just gun shows. It applies to all internet sales, all private sales. If I were to sell a gun to Loren, it wouldn't require a background check. The only time you need a background check, like Loren said, is when it's done by a federally licensed dealer. And as she said before, about 40% of those sales, of all gun sales, do not occur through a federally licensed dealer. Now, these background checks may seem like they're very burdensome, like they may take a long time, but 92% of them occur within 2 minutes while the individual is on the phone with the agency running the background check. Only a few of them take longer than 24 hours or even 48 hours. The problem with this system, though, is that states are not required to report those who are mentally ill, those who are documented as felons. They're not required to report that information to this national background check system. In fact, 3 states haven't reported anything at all to the federal system. So even those gun sales that do occur with a background check are not necessarily going through an accurate, effective system. So you have 40% of gun sales that are happening through private sales without a background check. And you have the remaining about 60% happening with a background check, but the background check isn't effective. And then a lot of gun rights supporters are also worried that if you run a background check, that the seller will maintain their document and they're going to be registered. And there's going to be a registry of everyone who owns a gun. But it explicitly says in federal law that they cannot maintain a federal registry. So the whole talk about background checks are going to lead to a registry, It's all kind of codswallop because it says in the law that they're not allowed to do that. And the federal legislation that was proposed in Congress recently said 3 times that you can't have a registry, just to be sure that the first time was, in case that wasn't enough. And what the proposed law that would have failed would have done, it would have created universal background checks. So all sales, private, through a licensed dealer, would have required a background check, and would have actually set limits on the amount of time these background checks could take. It would have set a limit of 48 hours for 4 years, and then within 4 years, all background checks would have had to be done within 24 hours. But as we know, that's failed. The other kind of loophole in federal law, it's not really a loophole though, is the lack of an assault weapons ban. So assault weapons is basically a semi-automatic gun, which means that it automatically loads. It doesn't automatically fire. You have to press the trigger each time to fire, but you don't have to reload it each time. So it's a semi-automatic weapon with about 2 cosmetic features, which means they have like a pistol grip or like a bayonet or some kind of scope on there. That's all an assault weapon is, really. But what gun manufacturers do is they manufacture around that. They'll be like, oh, I won't include a pistol grip. I won't include who needs a bayonet? I won't include a bayonet. And so that it's not classified as an assault weapon. So there was an assault weapons ban in place at the federal level for 10 years. Now, there's no conclusive study that says that the ban was effective at all. Also, it was only in place for 10 years, so you really can't accurately say, after 10 years, how can something be that effective? There was one study done by the Brady campaign that said it did reduce the amount of assault weapons found at crime areas from 5% to 2% in those 10 years. But besides that, there are conflicting studies about whether it was effective or not. Now, Congress did propose an assault weapons ban, and that failed as well. And that would have reinstituted the assault weapons ban, but it would have reinstituted it without a sunset provision, so it wouldn't have expired. It would have been in place forever until it got overturned at some point. It also would have instituted a magazine limit, so all magazines that, with the bullets that you put in the gun, all of them are manufactured at a minimum of 10 bullets. What this law would have done is said at a maximum magazines have to have only 10 bullets. Magazines can have 30, 50, even with just a handgun, you can have a detachable magazine with 30 bullets. And those are usually the kind of magazines that are used at the mass shootings that have occurred recently. But as we know, the assault weapons ban and the magazine capacity limit failed. I'm running a little short of my time, so I'm just going to briefly go over California laws. So despite the federal laws not actually going into place, California actually has the strictest gun control framework in the country. A recent study was done that said that the state gun death rate dropped by 56% from 1993 to 2010. And so what California can serve as a model is to show that it has all these restrictions in place and they haven't been found unconstitutional yet. And a lot of these things are the ones that gun rights supporters say are unconstitutional. But California has an assault weapons ban, it has a magazine limit, and it has universal background checks. None of those have been found to be unconstitutional yet. So the talk that all 3 of those are unconstitutional at the federal level is also suspect if they haven't been found unconstitutional yet in California. But California is also unique in the fact that it doesn't have a state constitutional right. So in addition to the federal constitution, the California constitution does not have a right to bear arms. So it's unique in that regard. There's only 6 states that do not have that right. But even so, the fact that none of these restrictions in California have been found unconstitutional federally, that's just some tools that you can talk about when a gun rights supporter says, no, background checks, assault weapons ban, all unconstitutional. Well, look to California. They haven't been found unconstitutional yet. And then my last point is just that the reason why the gun rights community is so good at kind of striking down these federal laws is because they're very organized. And not just crisis organized. They are continually organized. They go to the gun ranges together. They talk about these things online. They're very informed. They're not just like, oh, legislation's coming up, let's get organized right now, which is how the gun control movement is primarily organized. It's improved in the last 10 to 20 years with the Brady campaign, but they are still completely outmanned by the NRA and by other organizations. So what a general recommendation is that gun control communities need to get organized, and they need to be organized continuously, not just when a crisis comes up, not just immediately after a mass shooting. If you want to take action, you have to be organized, and you have to be organized for the long term. So I'll end there and pass it on there.
And now Rabbi Aaron Alexander will talk to us a bit about gun violence prevention through the lens of Judaism.
So, hi everybody. I want to start by thanking the Board of Rabbis for bringing Loren and Charles and me here. And I also just want to say that I'm proud of my Board of Rabbis for dedicating 2 of its sessions today, one to gun violence and one to immigration, to, I think, core issues for our community. Next year, you can add abortion, healthcare, capital punishment, and we can all lose our tax-exempt status together. I think the way to connect is through stories, and so I'm going to briefly tell you why I'm here. In 1996, I was at the University of Florida as an undergraduate student. Sitting in my room one afternoon when 2 16-year-old boys walked in, one with a sawed-off shotgun, and put it in my face. I was sitting with my girlfriend at the time and one of my closest friends in the fraternity that I belong to. I haven't told this story publicly because it's somewhat embarrassing. What these 2 16-year-old boys were looking for, looking to steal, they actually could have found in my possession. And the frustration that they felt through our shock led them to leave the room and come back in a moment later and say the exact same thing with the exact same gun pointed in our face, never with the intent, I imagine, of firing the gun. When they left, and this is a tragedy to a certain extent, but like all tragedies, there is an undercurrent of humor in it. When they left the gun, one of the 16-year-olds put the sawed-off shotgun under his shirt and he ran out of the fraternity house. One of my fraternity brothers, who was downstairs, saw somebody running out of the house with something under his shirt, yelled, "Hey, somebody's stealing one of our trophies," and chased him down into the parking lot, tackled him, and pulled out the gun, realized there was a gun. In that moment, I knew that based on fight or flight, that particular friend was somebody that I would want to be near for the rest of my life. He's also a rabbi today, incidentally. It's not a Jewish fraternity. My close friend in the fraternity was shaking. The first call was to 911. The second call, I saw him shaking and crying on the phone with his parents. I did not know at that point, because he had not told anybody, that 2 years earlier, his older sister was about to graduate from Washington University in St. Louis and was the victim of a carjacking, rape, murder. She was shot. She was with another young woman who was also shot but survived. And in that moment, I think, I grew up in Boca Raton, a small town in Indiana, in Boca Raton, Florida. I could not have been more sheltered in my upbringing. And I could not have been more sheltered in my first 2 years at the University of Florida, because you don't have to go into Gainesville, which is the Deep South, until you have to go into Gainesville, which is the Deep South. And from that point forward, I wanted to go into Gainesville, which was the Deep South, to understand where I lived. Like many of us, like for so many of us, Sandy Hook really cracked open my heart. And all of the Torah that I had learned in the previous 10 years could come through no other prism than that particular heinous act. All of the Torah that my rabbi and teacher, Sharon Grouse, had been preaching at me for 5 years, that I had somehow guarded myself against, about what it meant to actually live in the world, spilled out onto paper. And I just started writing, and from the writing I ended up on a delegation with the PICO National Network to meet with the president and the vice president's task force on gun violence. And I learned a lot of what Charles spoke about. I expected to be nuanced in military-style assault weapons, high-capacity magazines, spray features, and whatnot. And I know a tremendous amount about guns now, but what I didn't recognize or realize was that sitting in a room with clergy who were not like me, in fact 90% of them were from inner cities, urban areas, South LA, when they said, please share a story please share one story at your table of gun violence, the pastors laughed. One story. I buried 2 people last week, 16, 17 years old. More funerals in a month than any one of us will go to in a lifetime for people under the age of 12. Which I think leads me here. I honestly don't think we can go through another high holiday season without this being one of the main focal points of what it is that we as rabbis speak about to our congregations. And I think that there are a number of ways in which we can do that without the perception that we are being political and or divisive. I think that it's possible, and at the very least, I think that it's worth a shot. I have a packet, sorry I was late in putting this packet together, but I have a packet of texts that I put together, and also a few sermon starters. But they all come from the place of there's no more potent time to speak about the space between life and death than on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. There is no more potent prayer than Unatana Tokef. Who will die by? Who will die by? Who will die by guns? Well, here's what we know. We know that next week, likely, a child under the age of 18 will come across a gun in a home and accidentally shoot herself, or her sister, or her friend. We know that this will happen. If not next week, certainly the week after. What are we willing to do about it? When Moses is on Har Sinai with God, right, as God wants to destroy the Jewish people who let the waves go through the camp, kill each one of them. God says to Moses, Nichali, let me be. Let me be. And in that moment, there is a theological transformation, a theurgy, that exists that the Midrashas pick up on. And they say, how is it, if the Torah didn't say that God said to Moses, leave me alone, we would never have believed it. In that moment, Moses realizes that his mere presence, his face, his voice, actually will be the difference between who will live and who will die. I gave you the Midrash in the packet. In Jewish law, there's the concept of Bari and Shema, that which we are certain of and that which we are uncertain of. And on a Beit Din, if you have a certainty and an uncertainty, logically you will go with the certainty. And so if we begin to add up the things that we are certain about, as we've heard about, against that which we are uncertain about. So we are certain that if you have a gun in the home, you're significantly more likely to harm yourself or somebody else, not in self-defense, than save yourself from being killed. We know that. And yet, some of these very logical and common sense legislative ideas cannot pass. We are uncertain that the government will ever come after us. What do we know? We know that if they do, our guns will not stop them. We know that. In the face of certainty and uncertainty, I have a hard time coming to terms with inaction. What will be the Moses moment of saying, I simply have to show that I am here, and our presence matters. At ICAR, we're working with LA Voice, our local organizing agency. We held a mayoral forum for Garcetti and Gould, in which we could pose to them some of the key questions that are facing Los Angeles, one of them being gun violence and mass incarceration. connected, of course. And a new friend of mine, his name is Sean Huff, he served 18 years for a heinous crime. While in prison for 18 years, he became a minister, he became an addiction counselor, he became the last line of defense with those who were incarcerated who believed that nobody in the world could ever love them. He became, in prison, the paradigm of love. And there was nobody more qualified to go out into the inner city streets, our urban areas, and work with teens to show them precisely that same love when he came out of prison. And yet, he couldn't get a job. He couldn't get a job because, there's a box that we're working on here in Los Angeles to get rid of, which forces people to list before anybody has a chance to meet them face to face that they were imprisoned. AB 218 is what's coming up, and I urge everybody to ask me more questions about it. I'd love to tell you how dangerous this box is in the short term and the long term for the viability and the dignity of our communities. He looked up at Garcetti and Gruel, and he said, I couldn't get a job. I'm more qualified than anybody to go into the streets. I lived in those streets. And he said, it's okay, because I serve the God who specializes in the impossible. I serve the God who specializes in the impossible. What would it mean to stand up with our people on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and declare that even in the face of challenges that feel insurmountable on a federal level, that all of us together serve a God who specializes in the impossible? It's too easy to serve a God who specializes in the possible. We've been doing that for years. The God who specializes in the possible does not allow for the miracles that exist on a day-to-day basis.
I've got to give you one more minute so we can open this.
Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is trauma and tshuva. We don't have to talk about gun violence specifically, the act of gun violence. We can talk about the impact of gun violence. The trauma that exists after somebody experiences gun violence or even gunshots. So now imagine many of our youths who are walking through South LA to school every day with gunshots, literally navigating through cracks and crevices because they know exactly what areas to avoid because they've been in those areas before and seen people shot. The lasting effects of trauma have deep implications for our community, and there are some resources here for talking about trauma. I think Rabbi Artson, my teacher, my boss, wrote a book called Passing Life's Tests, where he narrates the Akedat Yitzchak story through Sarah's eyes. I think it would be fairly interesting to deal with trauma looking through the eyes of the other characters. Yitzchak too. But also Akedat Yishmael as well. And I would like to suggest that people be in touch with some of the organizations you've heard from today and bring somebody to speak before a shofar blowing.
Thank you very much. We literally have 2 minutes for questions, so please.
You spoke about the power of the gun lobby. What's there to counterbalance their effect? Because from my understanding, they are willing to spend hundreds of thousands or maybe more dollars to either promote candidates and support their opinion or to destroy candidates that oppose their opinion. Is there anyone who's doing anything similar to try and have some kind of balance?
Well, actually now we are fortunate that Michael Bloomberg is putting his fortunes behind Mayors Against Illegal Guns, and it's a national organization, and he described it as before he put a toe in, and now he's putting his whole foot in. So there is money behind it because most of the organizations in the past, the Brady Campaign, the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence, the other organizations were primarily, the advocacy groups were grassroots, very minimal funding. But now there are a lot of groups have sprung up. Moms Demand Action. I'm drawing a blank on the other one. A lot of other advocacy groups are are coming together right now, and joint forces of all these groups are having much more of an impact. But Mayors Against Illegal Guns is the one with money behind it, I have to say.
So, sorry, can I just follow up? So is the tactic now changing politicians as opposed to just keeping legislation going that ultimately always fails?
Well, if the legislation won't pass, then what has to happen is the politicians have to change, and so they will be targeted in future campaigns. And there has been stuff to show that in the last election, the places where the NRA put their money, they didn't spend it wisely, and they didn't do well. And so that the perceived power, that myth that the NRA is all powerful, and once they target somebody, that's the end of them. That is starting to erode. And the lunacy of the NRA and the craziness of the leadership of the NRA, not the membership, the leadership of the NRA, the craziness of that is really starting to show now, and I think people are really stepping away from that.
One more question.
So living in Los Angeles, we might have the thought that our state laws are so good, and our senators and our representatives are pretty solid on this. What is the most strategic thing? So what's the point? So what is the most strategic campaign we could take on as part of people living in Los Angeles to try to change any kind of gun law? Would it be something at the state level to strengthen it? Would it be something nationally? But how is California in this community?
And I hate to do this, but I keep having the door open saying the next session has to come in. So we have 3 amazing panelists. We're going to go in the hallway. If you have questions about the issues of with the public health approach, please talk to Loren. Legal approach, talk to Charlie. Judaic approach, talk to Aaron. They're going to be right outside the door.